Thanks everyone for popping into the chat where you're at with the webinar. I'm going to try not to repeat too much of what exists in the webinar because I'm hoping you still have time to watch it. And there's some incredible speakers there that can really speak well to this work in different ways than I can. My role at First Nations Health Authority is what I call administrative leadership of the standard, because the leadership in the content of the development and the amazing thinking that went into it was really on behalf of the technical committee that was gathered to develop the standard, while I just did what I could to support the technical committee to come together and arrive where we did at publication. And so I've been with this standard since the end of 2017 until it was published last summer in 2022. My role in my secondment at the Ministry of Health is to help the Ministry of Health come into alignment with the standard and its criteria where appropriate across the ministry, and also to continue supporting systems change around implementation and adoption of the standard and its criteria across our health system in various contexts. So I'll go ahead to next slide. And I'm doing this today from just my laptop, not my usual 3 screens at home. So hopefully I don't miss anything. And Kate, before I really dive in, I'll just do a quick time check with you. How much time do we have for this portion?
You're totally welcome to take the full 30 minutes. We are 10 minutes behind, but I would prefer we make that up somewhere else.
Okay, all right. Well, the overview. So the interesting thing about this standard, it's the first of its kind. In Canada, we know for sure, and we're also pretty certain in the world. So this was a partnership between Health Standards Organization, you can see their logo at the top, and First Nations Health Authority. And we received some funding from Health Canada as well to do this work. And as I mentioned, we started thinking about this back in 2017, but really launched in 2018. This is, just like Kate noted, is around clear instructions. This specifies responsibilities and accountabilities for cultural safety and anti-racism. And it really identifies throughout the criteria opportunities to do so across the system, across organizations, and in alignment as well with the patient journey, across that patient journey. And is really, there does somewhat a focus on, health organizations, but it really is intended for all health and social service organizations. And so, and for those of you who have experience with accreditation, there's often a number of criteria in any accreditation package or overarching standard that might not apply to every single instance that an organization encounters. For example, I used to work in residential addictions treatment, residential wellness, in which we would have criteria that would ask us about our morgue. Well, we didn't have a morgue. So it's not about being 100% compliant in the exact area of each of the criteria throughout the standard, but making it apply to where it makes sense in our organizations. And that's why this can have a broader reach. It's also in plain sight recommendation 8, which I'll talk a little bit about. If you could skip to the next slide, please, Kate. So I'm sure everyone's fairly aware of in plain sight, given all the work that's happened in the OPHO. But as you can see, recommendation 8 is that all health policymakers, health authorities, regulatory bodies, health organizations, facilities, PCQRBs, education programs, it's a long list, in BC adopt an accreditation standard for achieving Indigenous cultural safety through cultural humility and eliminating Indigenous specific racism. And that has been developed in collaboration and cooperation with Indigenous people, which we'll also talk about in these slides I have. If you could go to the next one. So just to talk a little bit about types of standards, this standard is an organizational standard, meaning it defines the quality and expectations of health and social services provided by entire organizations. So this isn't the same as educational standards or professional standards, and also isn't made to be in conflict or duplicating any of the work of those types of standards. So many of you may have heard about the cultural safety practice standard that was developed by the BC College of Nurses and Midwives and the College of Physicians and Surgeons, the BC College of Physicians and Surgeons. And this past fall was adopted, I think, by 13 more professional colleges. And so that professional standard lets registrants know, or members of that college know, how they're expected to act as an individual in their practice, how they serve people as an individual. And I think it's wonderful that these things were published very closely together, because we shouldn't be asking things of people in their practice that they aren't supported to do in their organization. And those two things should be aligned, so that if we're asking people to educate themselves, that those opportunities to be educated exist in their college and in their organizations. And there's many other examples like that. And when the practice standard was being developed by the College of Nurses and Midwives and the physicians and surgeons, they sent us an early draft of that. And we put that practice standard up against the organizational standard and made sure that there was a good connection there between what was being asked of in the criteria. So there could be that alignment between what we were asking of individuals and how we were asking organizations to show up in that space and support those individuals as well and improve those services overall. Next slide. So a little bit about the development pathway here. Like I said, we started in 2018 with Health Standards Organization and First Nations Health Authority to look at how would this standard really help and what would it look like to develop it. And there's just a few things I would say about that step. And one is that we know the business of accreditation and standards and criteria is a Western methodology, and isn't, what might be considered an Indigenous methodology or traditional Indigenous methodology. But as mentioned as well in the commitments of the OPHO, is that racism is hardwired throughout our system, and we must also then hardwire cultural safety and anti-racism. And so we're overlaying a process of Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing on this kind of Western methodology. And so this development pathway kind of demonstrates that. So when we established the committee, we ensured that was Indigenous representation, voices, and leadership from across the province. Importantly, this include patient partners and people from various disciplines who, had done a lot of leadership in this space. And it came time to pull together in the study portion of the types of information that we would base our learning on and how we would frame this on. We ensured to prioritize Indigenous authorship and Indigenous documentation to inform what would be developed into the criteria. Normally on standard technical committees, the process is then to vote on how to move forward the criteria, when to publish, and things like that. And instead, this committee determined that it would be best to come to a consensus. And then we went to public review. We ensured that when people were able to provide their thoughts online to the standard, they were able to identify if they were an Indigenous person, so that again, we could prioritize and privilege feedback from Indigenous people to the standard itself. We went to public review for 90 days, which is longer than most standards go to public review for, and it received a record-breaking number of comments in the history of standard development, and that being over 1,100. And so the technical committee made a commitment that every single comment during public review would be reviewed by the technical committee and be given thoughtful consideration. And so the development process of the standard, not only did it happen over COVID, which drastically changed some of our timelines and our ability to come together, but also the amount of time it took to respond to those 1,100 comments during public review. And finally, there was a consensus to arrive at in approving the standard. And there was a few steps that I'll talk about when we look at the composition of the technical committee of how we could meaningfully approve the standard before it was published in June 2022. And I think there's an animation there that overlays on the top of this as well, that if you could click again, Kate, that before this was published, we received the endorsement via motion by the First Nations Health Council and the First Nations Health Directors Association in March of 2022. You can go to the next one. So I really want to acknowledge the co-chairs of this technical committee, and that being Elder Jerry Ullman and Dr. Nell Wyman, who is now the acting Chief Medical Health Officer at First Nations Health Authority. But as you can see, we had a number of people who, you know, there's been movement in these positions, but are still great leaders in this work across the province. Dr. Becky Palmer, Tanya Dick, who is now also with the Ministry of Health, the president of the First Nations Health Directors Association, Keith Marshall, and then, you know, individuals in various roles, nurses, physicians, those in provincial health services, and then patient partners, and those who are in also our health authorities, where so much of where this standard can apply takes place, as it touches so many people in their patient journey. And just to acknowledge as well, Diana Clark, who's now with the Indigenous Health and Reconciliation team at the Ministry of Health. And one of the things that she did is brought together groups of individuals that gave their feedback to the standard and kind of did that in kind of breakout session format. So that 1,100 comments that we received, some of those represented feedback from groups of people. So I think that you know, a number of people were able to provide good feedback. And finally, where you see at the bottom there, engagement and input from Métis Nation BC, I want to be clear to say that, you know, from the beginning, we had invited Métis Nation to be on the technical committee, and they just made it known that it was an enormous time commitment, and it really was. The technical committee calls the development of the standard a real labor of love, and that they needed a debrief and therapy after it was finally finished for the many hours that they put into it. And Métis Nation just acknowledged that they didn't have the capacity to sit at the table full time. However, we engaged with them throughout the process and went through the standard with them as well, line by line, before it was published, and had their approval to move to publish as well. And that's where you'll see also, you know, mirroring other documents, but also the importance of the distinction-based approach that's used in the standard, that being First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and acknowledging that we don't want a pan-Indigenous approach to this, but there's a shared experience of colonization and racism and healthcare among Indigenous people, but wherever possible to take a distinguished-based approach. Next slide. So to get into a little bit of the details of the standard itself, you can see it's divided into 8 sections. And hopefully for you, as it does for me, these 8 sections represent kind of the breadth of our organizations and how they function, and we haven't left anything out. So you'll see that there's reciprocal accountability, meaningful partnership, governance, leadership, financial and physical infrastructure, human capacity, and a lot of Section 5 and human capacity relating to human resources as well. And then the culture of our organizations and of quality and safety, and the design and delivery of services, even down to how we collect evidence and conduct research and evaluation. So there being 91 criteria across those 8 sections. And one of the things I like to say in this standard is that I did a bit of a word search and find, and the word partnerships, I think, comes up close to 75 times, partners and partnerships. And the word relationship comes up, you know, almost 100 times throughout this standard. And it's in every single one of these sections. And that we know that the importance of having good relationships and partnerships, that this isn't something organizations do themselves, but that they need to be led by their Indigenous partners, and having good foundational relationships with them to meaningfully meet the criteria throughout this standard. Can you go to the next one, Kate? So this has some animation as well, so feel free to click through on a few. But the top there, you'll see is the standard subsection. So that's one of the 8 sections that I mentioned. And underneath that is the clause. And so the clause is just the introductory statement. This isn't what an organization would be measured against, but the following one is the criteria. So that's the one where I mentioned there's 91 of those. And this is the first section, the first clause, and the first criteria in the standard itself. And you can see that this is about a position statement. This is about leaders and organizations acknowledging that there was harm done, and acknowledging that there's racism and discrimination, and outlines the organization's commitment to addressing it. And so this, I think, mirrors the prioritization of truth when we talk about things like truth and reconciliation, and truth coming first in that acknowledgement. And then under the criterion in each of these are the guidelines. And so you might ask yourself in your various roles in the organization or in these various types of organizations, how do we actually meet this criterion? And so the guidelines are really there to help direct us. When we talk about clear guidance, Dr. Jerry Ullman and members of the technical, or sorry, Elder Jerry Ullman, Dr. Noah Wyman, and members of the technical committee said that this is the line in the sand. We can't give clear kind of direction in this and how we want to be served by our organizations. And under the guidelines, there's also a long list of references where people can do their own homework. So much of this work, when we're trying to implement this type of work in our organizations, tends to fall to like anyone with Indigenous or Indigenous health in their title, or the Indigenous person on a team. And we want that to be avoided. We don't want that burden to fall on the Indigenous areas of organizations or on Indigenous individuals, that it's everyone's job to be involved in this work and to do their own homework. And so you'll see many of the documents that you reference that this team calls the foundational commitments, like the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Report, like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and calls to action, and are threaded throughout this, the standard itself and throughout the document in terms of, okay, why did they have that criterion and why do the guidelines look like this? Well, it directs you to the areas of those documents that you can further your learning in if you're new to this area or if you want to do additional review. And on the next slide, there's just another example. And this is where I was talking about establishing inclusive and meaningful partnerships. And so purposeful, ongoing, inclusive, and effective communication. So on the following criteria, 2.1.6, it talks about collaborating with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people and communities. And I've been asked many, many times, what does that look like and how do we do that? And so hopefully the guidelines under that really help direct people. And then it comes to asking within those relationships. Go ahead to the next one, please. So just a little bit about information about the launch. So in June, we were at the Quality Forum. We had a number of the technical committees there speaking to the standard itself, including the technical committee co-chair, Dr. Noah Wyman, and some of our patient partners and members of the, I should say, the vice presidents of Indigenous health at health authorities in various areas of the province, speaking to kind of what this means. And so that was a really well attended workshop. And then we had some of the criteria on tables and asked people to kind of work through what it would look like to meet those criteria in their areas of work. We also had a national webinar. So that's the link that you all received. And I highly recommend it because one of the things that happens in that national webinar is really hearing from the members of that technical committee and kind of what their hopes are for adoption of the criteria and the standard itself, and how to breathe life into it and some of the meaning behind it. We also had some news releases in English and French. We have a client and family information sheet in English and French. And, you know, we've been doing systems engagement on this well before it was ever published and continue to do so as everyone who was involved is pretty much a champion because, like I said, it was such a labor of love to kind of get it published. But the technical committee portion was officially closed in ceremony on October 18th in Musqueam Territory because it was important to acknowledge that that portion of development was complete and now it really was a gift that was given to the system by this technical committee, by the authors of all the documents that provided the foundation for it, and by all the people who provided their comments and public review to move forward with it as those clear set of guidelines. Next slide. So a few technical things to be clear on is that this standard was published as a reference standard. So when we say reference standard, we mean a guide for wise and best practice, because it's not one that anyone is being measured against immediately. Most standards are published as a reference standard for 12 to 18 months. Because if an organization was going to have their survey, meaning they were going to have people come in and critique them on whether or not they had met the criteria that they must in their package of accreditation standards, they wouldn't be ready because they hadn't had time to adopt it. But the attention and activity is underway to move it from reference to assessment. So assessment meaning one that you would be assessed against as part of your regular accreditation cycle. Some of those cycles are 2 years, some of them are 4 years. So in terms of the system kind of coming online with this adoption and being assessed, that will happen over a number of years. But one thing we want to be clear about as well in terms of where the references standard is now as a reference standard and the time that it'll take to adopt this is we note that the journey of cultural humility is a lifelong journey for individuals, and that there's no expectation on behalf of any member of the technical committee that I heard or anyone else who's been involved in this that any organization will be 100% compliant with all of the criteria by their next accreditation cycle. That this work is meant to evolve, and well, our organizations will get better and better at meeting that criteria and exceed that criteria. And once the standard is out for 3 years, there's also the opportunity to revisit it and update it. So as our systems gets better, our knowledge gets better, we have the opportunity to improve that as well before the next round of individuals and organizations moving through accreditation. Can you know the next one, Kate? So a little bit about moving from reference to assessment. When I was at FNHA, before I left, we wrote a joint proposal to Health Canada, who supported the funding of the development of the reference standard through their call for proposals on addressing racism and discrimination in Canada's healthcare system. And we had 2 streams in that proposal. And one was moved to the assessment standard, like I just mentioned, and the other was to collaborate across Canada on a national standard. So that was what we heard back from many other jurisdictions across the country of how can we make this work in our province or territory. And so BC, as in many ways leading the way in this work in the country, has provided kind of an outline here for other areas. And so it might not take as long maybe in Alberta or Ontario to develop a standard in those areas because we've provided that foundation, but again, to acknowledge the difference between the provinces and the work that needs to happen. I'm happy to say that that proposal was approved. And so First Nations Health Authority is working with Health Standards Organization to take that to next steps, and they're going to need to gather another committee because some of the outstanding questions there are things like who can actually assess this standard. So in accreditation processes, there's surveyors that come into the organization and they look at policies and procedures, and they talk to leadership, and they talk to patients, and they talk to partners to determine whether we're in alignment with any number of criteria. And so who can actually assess this? Can somebody who is non-Indigenous assess this? What does the training look like for surveyors? And so there's a number of things that need to be really thought about. And of course, some of that work was underway as part of the development during the technical committee phase. But it needs to be affirmed, and those are hard questions to answer and ones that we need to collaborate around. And the previous ADM of Indigenous Health and Reconciliation provided a letter of support for moving this forward, this proposal, as well as VPs of Indigenous Health in various health authorities. And the work in terms of partnership at the Ministry of Health and under my ADM, Teresa Dobmeyer, it continues to support that advancement in the system as well to move to assessment and adoption of the standard overall. Next one, please. So I think this is kind of one of the really important parts for me, because it's great that it's out there, but how do we make sure people know about it and are prepared to adopt it and feel supported to and like they're in step with their partners? So as I mentioned, this was endorsed for your motion by FNHC and FNHDA in March and is complementary to the practice standards that have been adopted by many health professional bodies and colleges. One of the things that we've been asked to be really clear about in our communications is that it is a reference standard so that people kind of don't feel overwhelmed. And this also was part of the communications with Leadership Council. So Leadership Council being the CEOs of the health authorities in BC, as well as our ministry leadership, who developed a joint communications that would be launched in each health authority across their organizations of how they were going to adopt and align to the standard and its criteria, and work during the time it was a reference standard to be prepared for the time it was an assessment standard. On the next slide, I have a little bit more information about those of us who are kind of the busy bees doing the work. So we continue to have conversations with Métis Nation BC in terms of advancing the standard. There's often kind of a conversation around the First Nations component being the larger population, having the First Nations Health Authority, taking up a lot of space in that conversation. And just like the standard itself it notes the importance of a distinctions-based approach, we want to make sure that's Métis Nation continues to have an ongoing voice as part of that conversation and in the adoption alignment of the standard. Further, in terms of preparing organizations for assessment, we have the PHSA accreditation leads. So those are the accreditation leaders in all the organizations under PHSA, and the Provincial Accreditation Advisory Committee. So that is the accreditation leads in every health authority in BC. And we worked with those two bodies during the development phase, during the technical committee phase, for their feedback to the standard as well, the development process, the communications process. And now we're also working with those organizations in terms of preparing for an assessment standard. There's a lot of technical components in terms of what they call attestation, proving how you meet the standard in various ways, whether that be through documentation. How can we do that remotely? How can we do that without putting undue burden on Indigenous patients and partners, et cetera, and proving that we meet the standard? So the incredible knowledge and experience of those two committees have been really important in terms of the systems communication and collaboration for change. And then also the Ministry of Health, Indigenous Health and Hospital Services teams have had a strong partnership and communications around moving this work forward in a quality aspect overall, and have been preparing to launch it in our patient care quality offices and comparing what's required of us under legislation and what's required of us in the criteria and mapping those two. And furthering the work of In Plain Sight overall and the recommendations of In Plain Sight related to complaints specifically. So there's some intensive work happening in that area. And one of the big next steps is with the National Collaborating Center for Indigenous Health. So you may know that Collaborating Center was led by Dr. Margot Greenwood, who is now Senator Margot Greenwood, who is also a member of the technical committee. And now that she's moved on to senator, she's had to give up her leadership of the Collaborating Center. And so it is now Dr. Sheila Blackstock. We're working with Dr. Sheila Blackstock and team. Dr. Sheila Blackstock is also a board member of First Nations Health Authority to develop training and education materials. And so we're going to work with all of the partners that have been involved in the development and some of these leads that you see here on this slide to break the standard into sections and develop some kind of learning resources for each of those sections. So we have the guidelines there, but it's kind of like expanding on the guidelines, having some video resources and things like that, so people can really feel like they understand it and hook onto the standard itself. So that is in its beginning stages and is being swim lane really in development with moving from reference to assessment on the standard. Go ahead, Kate. So I'm just rounding out here, just finishing out in terms of our work at the Ministry of Health. So before this standard was even published in last June, in May, our deputy signed a decision briefing note to operationalize the standard within the ministry. And so a big part of my job that I've been brought on to do in my secondment is to try to move that work forward in terms of the Ministry of Health coming into alignment with the standard and the criteria. And so what we have developed is through each division in the ministry, a champion has been identified to sit on a champions working group. And that working group just launched this past January. Their job is to develop an implementation plan. We have to look at things like, what does this look like for our human resources capacity? How do we communicate? What do we need to be prepared for in terms of resources and budget requirements and things like that? So we've had a few meetings that I've been so grateful to have Elder Jerry Ullman join with us to really bring the conversation and the knowledge and leadership around why the standard itself was developed and what meaning it has for him. And so a few of the people who are on this call today, like Dr. Danielle Van Smith is a member of that Champions Working Group, and Kate has been to that Champions Working Group. And so they're good people to chat with as well in terms of your division's upcoming kind of work in that area. And we'll be coming together for the first time in March. Sorry, and Kathleen, acknowledge Kathleen is there as well. So each division really preparing for what self-assessment looks like for them and what is the best way to communicate within that division so that we feel like we're moving forward in this work together, and no one's kind of left behind in terms of how does this touch my work and how could I do things differently or better to really eliminate Indigenous specific racism and hardwire that into all of the work that we do. Hardwire cultural humility in the outcome of cultural safety and what we do. Next slide. Oh, there was another one there. Last bullet, I should say. So I just want to acknowledge that, again, this is the Indigenous Health and Reconciliation team are really holders of the process. And not to be leading this for each division, again, where it's all of our work and not up to anyone with Indigenous or Indigenous health in their title to be carrying it, but we all have to do our homework like is outlined in the standard itself. Now we can go to the next one, which is the last one. So any open time for questions or discussions, and then I'll pass it back to you, Kate, for next activities.